So I must begin my talk by extending thanks to His Holiness, the Catholicos of all Armenians, and His Eminence, Archbishop Vicken. It's a very important, timely conference, and I really appreciate the gracious invitation to be here and to address it. And a special word of thanks must go to the organizing team who's done such a wonderful job of pulling it together and making us all feel very comfortable. It's also been a pleasure to see some old friends here. I was surprised and very happy to find Bishop Martyrosian here at the very beginning of the conference. He's not with us here, but when I first went to Nagorno-Karabakh in 1991, he hosted us. I was in his home as Grud missiles were raining down on Stepanakert. Another old friend whom we reconnect with here today is Caroline Cox, Baroness Cox, with whom we shared that experience and many others in Nagorno-Karabakh and elsewhere. And then it's been a great pleasure and privilege to meet new friends as well at such a conference. It's a great privilege to be here in Echmanazin, the mother see of the first nation, to bow before Jesus Christ as Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And the honor is all the greater as the Armenian nation's allegiance to the Christian faith, first forged in 301 AD, has withstood over centuries violent genocidal persecutions and also alluring secular seductions. The Christian faith remains today an intrinsic element of the Armenian national identity, and long may that be the case. Before I get into my talk, I should just mention something about Christian Solidarity International so you know where I'm coming from and the basis of my talk. CSI was founded as a Christian human rights organization. We do advocacy work. We deliver aid to the persecuted. But what I want to stress are the foundations, because I sensed in some of the talks that we share spiritual foundations with many others. The General Secretary of the World Council of Churches referred to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, when one part suffers, the other parts suffer with it. When one part feels joy, the others are joyous with us. So this concept of the body of Christ is one of the pillars of CSI, and we have an obligation to share in the joys and the sufferings of the persecuted parts. Then there's also the parable of the Good Samaritan, where we don't know really who the victim was, but the Good Samaritan went and helped. Might have been somebody from his community, might have been from some other community, might have been an enemy, might have been somebody who had threatened his life, but he went and helped. Questions weren't asked, and he took risks to do it. So we try to hold the Good Samaritan up as a model. And then from the secular world, it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in many ways, in a secular way, encompasses these biblical principles, and these are the pillars on which CSI stands and on which I address you today. The title of my talk is Beyond the Armenian Genocide in Time and Space, Religious Cleansing in Progress. And I thought of the subtitle in connection with a report that Baroness Cox and I wrote entitled Ethnic Cleansing in Progress, War in Nagorno-Karabakh. But I thought I would not emphasize the ethnic side or the ethnicity, but it could well have been entitled Religious Cleansing in Progress, War in Nagorno-Karabakh. So the essence of my message is that the spirit of the Armenian genocide transcends the apocalyptic events of 1915, 1918, and it was and remains today a profoundly important event, first and foremost for the Armenian nation. But the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan, the very public campaigning by Armenian civil society groups for international recognition of the genocide, and the abundance of Armenian genocide study programs bears witness to that reality. But this first great genocide of the 20th century, one that famously inspired Hitler to embrace genocide as an instrument for fulfilling his secular utopian dreams, is also a seminal event for the broader global body of Christ and indeed for the world at large. Over the next few minutes, I will endeavor to connect dots scattered over time and space. The connections link the Armenian genocide with the growing phenomenon of religious cleansing. Moreover, I will do so with special reference to Christian communities that face violent existential threats. Christians, of course, are not the sole the sole victims of genocide, but it is right that Christian leaders remain focused on the health and well-being of the body of Christ, as distinct from the rest of the world. The dots to be connected in my talk are scattered far and wide, so should you conclude at the end that my talk was all over the place, you may not be altogether wrong. My starting point is 30 years ago. In October 1991, I first visited Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh, with my colleague Caroline Cox, on one of many, the first actually, of many CSI human rights fact-finding and humanitarian missions to the region. It was a profound experience for me as a young historian journalist. The political context, though, is no less important than what we found out than what we discovered on the ground. And so I'd like to share a little bit of that with you. And of course, Father Patrick Sukdeo alluded to this in a very direct way in his talk. The visit to Karabakh coincided with the end of the Cold War, the triumph of the Washington-led liberal capitalist empire over its Moscow-led Soviet communist counterpart, and the proclamation by U.S. President George H. Bush of a new world order. The prevailing view of its bipartisan architects was that the West's Cold War victory marked the advent of a Washington-led unipolar world with liberal democracy as the final form of human government and the end point in mankind's ideological evolution. This utopian terminus of secular eschatology was branded, as we heard earlier, the end of history by Francis Fukuyama. And one of the things that Father Patrick didn't mention is that the book, 1992, emerged from a 1988 essay while Francis Fukuyama was the deputy director of the State Department's Office of Planning. It came from the State Department. It was not just an intellectual in California or some other place. The whole end of history concept was formulated and developed at the State Department before the Cold War formally ended. The end of history ideology is often packaged and presented to the public as American exceptionalism, and it has animated American foreign policy up to the present time. And what it has also created is something of an international religious freedom industry, you might call it that, in Washington, set in motion by the International Freedom Act of 1998 as a means of creating soft power to shape opinion at home and abroad, setting up of a special envoy for religious freedom, an office within the State Department, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and aligned non-governmental actors. And other Western states, most notably the United Kingdom, followed suit. But back to Karabakh. 30 years ago, my colleagues and I did not find much there to give credence to the end of history ideology. We encountered instead history redux, the continuation of the process of ethnic religious cleansing of Armenian Christians from their ancient homeland. The historical dynamic of the Armenian genocide had been revived, and the history of those events, the Armenian Karabakhis' struggle for self-determination, the violent reactions in the form of anti-Armenian pogroms in Sumgait, Kirovabad, and Baku, the deportation of entire Armenian villages in Operation Ring, the Soviet-Azerbaijani-Turkish blockade of Karabakh, and the violent counter-reactions of Karabakhi Armenians. All of these events are very well known to those who are at this conference. There was in the early 1990s a marked tendency on the part of most Western observers to explain the bloody crisis in this tiny patch of Armenian territory with its roughly 180,000 inhabitants as a minor leftover problem of communism, one that would be resolved by the replacement of Soviet totalitarianism with a capitalist liberal democracy. It might still take some time. It might require the banging of heads together of some uncooperative dictators. It would require some fair and free elections and an influx of Western capital. But sooner or later, this multi-religious, multi-ethnic region would inevitably thrive within the emerging peaceful, liberal, democratic world order. This Cold War perspective failed to consider an important reality. The spirit of the Armenian genocide was not bound in time to 1915 to 1918, nor in space to Anatolian Turkey. It extended far beyond Anatolia into the Caucasus. At the end of the First World War, in the shape of the massacre of 10 to 30,000 Armenians in Baku, it was carried out by Enver Pasha's Ottoman Islamic Army of the Caucasus, without which Azerbaijan would not exist today as an independent state, according to contemporary Azerbaijani historiography. This was followed by the massacre of half the population of Shushi in 1920 by the Army of Azerbaijan, a byproduct of the genocide. But such proceedings were not suspended by President Wilson's 14 points, but by the imposition of Soviet atheistic totalitarianism in the early 1920s, bringing with it yet another form of religious persecution. But as the Soviet power crumbled 3 decades ago, the dynamics that produced the genocide quickly reemerged in Karabakh. Those dynamics of the Armenian genocide are alive and well and with us today. There was another missing line in the prevailing narrative of the extended process of Armenian genocide, and it was that of religion. Western discourse, and perhaps even Armenian discourse too, about these events has been largely secularized, thereby marginalizing its salient sectarian dimension. The destruction of the Armenian Christian community in the Ottoman Empire was driven simultaneously by a combination of secular, ultranationalistic forces and those animated by the Ottoman Caliphate's jihad against the infidel, the kuffar, or the raya, as they were known at that time. The genocide was carried into the Caucasus as a modern-day jihad directed by the architects of the jihad in Anatolia. This mix of Sharia-based Muslim supremacism, rooted in the ancient religious traditions of jihad and dhimitude, together with modern ultranationalism, also resulted in the religious cleansing of non-Armenian Christian communities, in particular the Syriac Orthodox, the Assyrians, and subsequently the Greek Orthodox. The process of this genocide was not only anti-Armenian, it was fundamentally anti-Christian and had deep roots in the long tradition of violent jihad. There is obviously a need for sensitivity when addressing these sectarian issues. We have no interest in fighting religious wars, but we need to understand the sectarian drivers of religious cleansing and find appropriate ways of thwarting them. We also need to understand that violent jihad, whether declared explicitly or executed implicitly, is a religious war. It cannot be satisfactorily explained in purely secular terms. If we now fast forward back to the 21st century and the post-Cold War world, we can find President George W. Bush in Istanbul in 2004 declaring that Turkey is a country, quote, with 150 years of democratic and social reform, end quote. One that, quote, stands as a model to others and as Europe's bridge to the wider world, end quote. These sentiments were echoed by his successor in Ankara in a speech to the Turkish parliament in 2009. Regrettably, Turkey continues to be a model for others, but not as a conveyor of liberal democracy nor of religious freedom. Instead, we see that Turkey's tradition of religious cleansing becomes an ever more commonplace characteristic of the real world order as opposed to the theoretical one. For ancient Christian communities, the Levant, Mesopotamia, the New World Order has brought grave existential threats. Those communities, including their Armenian components, have recently been decimated by the revival of violent jihad. Many Armenian Christians from Aleppo, once a safe haven for the persecuted, have had to seek refuge here in Armenia, just as many survivors of the Great Genocide did. But it is not only the existence of Christians in the Bible lands that face an existential threat. Violent jihad is also on the march throughout much of sub-Saharan Africa. This vast region is often and rightly referred to as the hope of the Christian world on account of Christianity's dynamic growth and the fervor of its faith communities. But violent jihad is today targeting that hope throughout the Sahel region, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, even Congo and Mozambique, believe it or not. Sub-Saharan Africa is becoming the new sanctuary for the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and a host of other Islamic terror groups. Scarcely a day goes by when we do not get reports of 5, 10, 20, 30 or more killed or displaced in attacks, especially, not exclusively in Nigeria, but especially in Nigeria. Yet, as in the days of the Armenian genocide, the cries of the victims go largely ignored or even denied by the powers and principalities of the international state system. Perhaps we are living on the cusp of the end of history. If so, it increasingly looks more like a hell for many Christians, many millions of Christians, than a liberal democracy utopia with religious freedom for all. The growing spirit of post-humanism as the fourth industrial revolution gains momentum does not augur well for the future of religious freedom. As members of the body of Christ, we must work for its health and well-being. We cannot stand on the sidelines while its most vulnerable limbs and organs, in fact, our most vulnerable limbs and organs, are crushed and severed. This is not, as Archbishop Angelos said, it is not a peripheral concern to us, although one might think so when looking at the Christian world generally in the Western world. It does stand on the periphery as a rule. It is a vital interest, and we must act as if it's a vital interest. So my plea to this conference is to avoid as much as possible being fully co-opted into the secular ideologies and agendas of the powers and principalities of the world, but to redouble efforts to challenge those who deny religious freedom and those who fuel religious cleansing, with inspiration coming primarily from the biblical prophetic tradition rather than secular ideologies. Let us simultaneously ramp up efforts to strengthen Christian unity of action despite our many and deep theological and political differences, and a good place to start would be to raise consciousness of the Armenian genocide in its broader sense as a living reality in the world today. I will conclude with some wise words. The first set came from Benjamin Franklin at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. "Gentlemen," he said, "we must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall hang separately." So it is with the body of Christ today. Reversal of the rising tide of religious cleansing will require much more of us than unity of spirit. It will cost, in the words of another great statesman, nothing less than blood, sweat, and tears, and not only for those who are on the front lines of persecution. Thank you very much for your attention.